This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This episode has been dedicated in memory of Vera Perlman, who loved learning and teaching. And this episode is also sponsored by Barbara and Joel Rich in commemoration of the 13th yahrzeit of Barbara's mother, Leeba bat Yitzchak Meyer. We still have episodes available for sponsorship in the Book of Shmot. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. We are thrilled about the upcoming Kitvuni conference to be held on March 8th in New York City at the Lincoln Square Synagogue, titled Telling the Story, Writing, Teaching, and Sharing Our Legacy. This unbelievable conference will feature a panoply of Matan scholars and the Kitvuni writers, alongside moving leaders of American Jewish communities. This conference will both serve as a book launch for the 3 Kitvuni books published in English and as moving Pesach preparation for all of those who are attending. A reminder to check out Rabbanit Shani Tarragon's Secrets of the Scroll podcast on any podcast feed and on the Matan website. This is a series on Megillat Esther, brought to you by Matan Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. In Parshat Mishpatim, we receive our first major collection of laws. The collection's opening addresses slavery, likely because it's a category close to the hearts of recently freed slaves, and moves to topics such as kidnapping, harm to a pregnant woman, damages to crops, and thievery. There's a brief address of laws regulating one's relationship with the divine, a brief hint to the deeper purpose for creating a society based on the stipulations of this detail-oriented Parsha, the prohibition to utilize sorcery, and then discusses the proper treatment of weaker members of society. Principles also deeply connected to our experience as the weak members of Egyptian society. Monumental guidelines regarding judicial integrity, as well as how we should treat our enemies, are also included in the Parsha. The Parsha ends in chapter 24 with the ratification of this covenant with God. It is essentially the closure of the Sinai experience, replete with the nations gathering, a meal, and God's invitation to Moshe to come up to the heavens and receive the Luchot. This week is also Parshat Shkalim, which adds a special maftir reading to the Torah reading and shifts the Haftorah to the one we will explore today in the Book of Melachim. The Haftorah reading for this week is from Melachim Bet, Perek Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, the 11th and 12th chapter, read with slight variation in different communities. Sfaradim begin from chapter Yud Aleph, verse 17, and Ashkenazim begin in Perek Yud Bet in the 12th chapter. Our conversation will cover the content of both of these prakim, which essentially shine a light on a complex time for the Judean leadership, alongside King Yoash's reforms regarding upkeep of the Mikdash. To unpack this week's Haftorah, I'm very happy to be sitting here with a new guest, Rabbi Yaakov Beasly. Hi, Rabbi Beasly.
Hi.
Rabbi Beasly has been teaching Tanakh in programs in Israel and abroad for over 35 years. Rabbi Beasly wrote 2 works on Trei Asar, each book addressing 3 different prophets in the 12 prophets for the Magid Tanakh series, as well as numerous other articles on approaches to Tanakh study. He is presently the Tanakh coordinator at Yeshivat Hesder Lev Torah. I'm really happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about a very interesting character.
So why don't we start with the idea of Parshat Shkalim as we're entering these 4 parshiot.
So the Mishnah says, Mashmeim b'rishon la'adar mashmeim al shkalim v'al kilayim, that this is a custom already set up in the Mishnah and Megillah, that from the time that we approach Adar, we start warning people about paying their taxes and making sure their fields have no kilayim on them. This is a very dry, simple idea.
Yeah.
And yet I think it's a really very fascinating way to go into the month. And at the end of this podcast, you'll ask me what it has to do with Purim. But for now, let's just talk, what does Mishpat, what does the idea of the half shekel mean to you?
In the world we live in right now, or in the world that had a Beit Mikdash?
That's a great question, because it seems the rabbis of the Mishnah knew exactly what they were doing when they set this up to make it both relevant to the time of the Beit Mikdash and us now. So I'll ask you first.
I think the first thing that catches me with the mitzvah of Machatzit shekel is the idea of communal involvement, meaning it could be for a central worshiping purpose of the Mikdash, it could go to something else, but it's this idea that everybody has to take responsibility for, I think, religious institutions in the society. But I'm curious what you think about that and if that's correct.
I think that's a really interesting idea. Now, the half shekel in the time of the desert, where did it go to?
To counting them.
To the Adanim, the actual sockets. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading, I don't remember the name of the Drasha book, was such a beautiful idea that you give half a shekel, and all this is melted together, and the silver is the sockets that hold the Mishkan together. That this way every person has a share in the Mishkan. Really, I'm holding the Mishkan up. I'm part of this.
Part of the foundation of it.
And part of the foundation, part of the community. This is not something that belongs to private individuals. We're going to come back to this theme in the Haftorah. And if you look at the Beit HaMikdash itself, the half shekel went to two, the Mishnah says it went to two places. One is Korbanot Tzibur. There is no such thing as a sacrifice that is offered on behalf of the community where not everybody gets to participate. Everybody has to be an equal member. And Rav Moshe Lichtenstein in his study of Haftorah calls this a democratization of the process, meaning that everybody is equal here. There has to be some aspect of the Mishkan which is that we're all together in this, and nobody can look and say, my contribution is better than yours. And then, of course, we have which plays, of course, Shkalim is going to be followed by Truma, which is voluntary offering. So there's a mechanism for both everybody giving, and then what are your talents, what are your abilities, what can you offer, and that's where you go a step beyond the half shekel.
Okay, so let's bring ourselves into that parak in Melachim Bet. The story really starts in the 11th chapter. This is it's a bloody, complicated moment. On one hand, I'll just bring us into the figure of Ataliyah, and then I want you to really dig us deeper in there. But on one hand, we have a moment where she was the daughter of Achav and Izebel, and so she marries into the Judean line. So we have a political alliance essentially between the northern and southern kingdoms, but she's quite a poisonous influence into the southern kingdom. So why don't you bring us into that space?
So let's go back really only 20 years from here. I'm going to date this as about 860 before the Common Era, and I'll explain where we get those numbers from in a second.
Okay.
We have a king in Yehuda who's considered a great person, Yehoshaphat, and we have, of course, King Achav in the north, married to the Phoenician princess Izabel, and she's the first one to bring the foreign gods from outside of Israel into the land. One can argue that even Yeravam, he's worshiping God through a golden calf, which is not acceptable, but at least he is still directing his service towards God. But now we have foreign gods being brought in, foreign influences. And Yehoshaphat is going to make a good-hearted but strategic mistake, which is to bring the two houses together. He's there to help Achav. He's there trying to reunite the kingdoms, as it were. But he doesn't do so. He doesn't draw the boundaries that are necessary to preserve the pure worship of Hashem. And really the only word, there is no such thing as impure worship of Hashem. We call that avodah zarah. We call that idol worship. And so he marries off his son Yoram to Ataliah. He becomes king. He becomes king, and then when he is killed, his brother kills all his other brothers. We start to see the non-Jewish influence come to fore, Achaziah, and then in the year 841, which we can actually date from the Assyrian sources, Yehu kills off the house of Achav in the north, and Ataliah does it in the south. As a response, which is a fascinating, when we say that she kills off, she's killing off her children, she's killing off her grandchildren, she's killing off any member of Beit David. If Yehu is going to kill off every member of the house of Achav, any descendant of David will be killed off too. And then we have one of these quiet heroines who always appear in Jewish history. There's always some woman who shows up at the nick of time without this, our story ends, and her name is Yehosheva, and she comes and she saves a little baby named Yoash and smuggles him out to Yehoiada, who is the Kohen Gadol at this time in the Beit HaMikdash.
I just want to interject for a moment with the psukim because they're very chilling, right? It says about Ataliyah, "V'takom v'ta'abed et kol zera hamamlacha." It's like a very short refrain, but she gets up and essentially said slaughters who are her children and grandchildren, and it's just she's a villain in the way that Izebel is a villain, right? We have these female villain characters.
Which really says to the way the Tanakh views woman agency. Women are capable of tremendous good and tremendous evil as well.
I just also want to say that we have, again, the Pasuk about Yosheva, Vatikach Yosheva, Bat HaMelech Yoram, Achot Achaziyahu, et Yoash ben Achaziyahu. She takes, right, identifies her, the house that she's a part of. She takes Yoash, right? She hides him away so that Athaliah won't be able to kill him. Well, let's just say you mentioned these women who like show up in the nick of time. So I don't know if I've ever mentioned in the podcast, but there's a wonderful doctorate written by a woman named Edna Hilvitz, and she goes through 26, what she calls it like a genre, 26 stories where you have a woman who shows up to save lives. Okay, sometimes it's her child, sometimes it's the Am Yisrael in the case of Esther. Exactly. There's 26 women that she goes through, and there are certain characteristics of those stories that always repeat themselves. God actually isn't in them. It's the woman who does it herself. She's always successful. There's a bunch of really, really moving elements to it, and I always this pasuk always brings a smile to my face because one of my children, we lived in the South, had a metapelet. She had a caregiver in the daycare whose name was Yehosheva. She was a black Hebrew from Dimona, and that was her name. And I thought that was always very beautifully ironic that she cared for babies.
We're so used to Elishevas, and
exactly.
Yehosheva's a beautiful name.
It's a beautiful name, and that's something that always brings a smile to my face. Okay, so we have here the fact that the Yoash is saved.
And he is then smuggled to Yehuda in the Beit HaMikdash, and he's hidden there for 7 years. The Mefarshim debate where he's hidden. Is he hidden in the upper attic? There are some that say he was actually brought up in the Kodesh Kodashim. And I've always tried to envision that. Did they put a little basketball hoop? How does one change type? There's so many questions as a race, but the Kohanim have turned against the queen, and they will lead a revolt and overthrow Atalia. And at the age of 7, Yehoash is going to be the new king. Which
is unusual on many accounts, right? Meaning growing up in the Mikdash is nothing we usually have. The fact that they groom a king and then appoint him at age 7, that's not something that we have stories like that.
It's a very strange, episode. And here's where the Sephardim begin in the middle of chapter 11. I think the reason why they do it is because they take the last 4 verses of chapter 11 and the first 17 of chapter 12, which is what our story really is, and then they get the magic number 21, which is what the Mishnah requires. Ashkenazim have a tendency to take shorter Haftorah if they are consistent in one story.
Interesting. Okay.
But the Sephardim generally will add more psukim in order to hit that magic number. Either way, it's important for our story because we are going to be judging Yehoash, his actions as he grows up, keeping in mind where did he grow up and who raised him.
Yeah.
So in chapter 12, we have, after Atalia has been killed and he is now installed as king, it describes very little about his formative years, but all of a sudden he decides that he is going to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. And obviously the question is, what needs to be rebuilt? What needs to be done? And that's the first question we're going to look at in Divrei Yamim. The second thing that it says is that he then appoints the Kohanim to be responsible for collecting the money. Sometime later, in the 23rd year of his reign, when he's 30, he will berate the Kohanim where nothing's gotten done. The water still doesn't work. The flooring hasn't been fixed. What's happened? And he institutes a brand new way of collection. Essentially, he puts the world's first pushka. He and Yehuda put the world's first pushka into the Beit HaMikdash, people who come and visit. And we're going to see how this plays out in Divrei Yamim. And they're able to rebuild first the foundations. And the text here says that they don't build anything out of silver and gold. That they're really focused on the foundations. Divrei Yamim is going to give us a slightly different reason or description of what is happening, and we'll take a look at why those stories differ. He
wants to have the pushka, as you called it, in a public space, I'm assuming also because he doesn't trust that the Kohanim are not stealing it?
And that becomes the question, what is he thinking at these point in times? So I want to start with really the verse 3 in chapter 12.
Okay.
Vayash Yehoash hayashar b'nei Hashem kol yamav asher harau Yehuda Kohen. And as long as he is getting guidance from Yehuda HaKohen, Yoash is a good king.
Important qualifier.
Important qualifier. Yeah. The Malbim comes and says something very interesting, is the Malbim style is, of course, to look at different words, different synonyms, and find the exact difference. And he describes the difference between a hora'ah versus a milamed. There's a moreh and there's a milamed. What's the reverse of a milamed? Is a lomed. What's the reverse of a moreh? We don't have one. It's interesting. And the Malbim suggests that a milamed is somebody who teaches and the recipient internalizes those lessons. The hora'ah, the moreh, is giving instructions, but they're not necessarily being internalized. There's external obedience, but it's not inside.
The angle of Yehoyada essentially becomes his parent. I know it's horahu from to teach, but it also sounds right. It's the same as a horeh, like as a parent. And there's a part of me that thinks that that's the difference, is because Yehoyada is not only his religious teacher; he's essentially taking responsibility for him as a human.
Which is really, and this is the king who is growing up.
Yeah. And
the Haftorah ends very happily because it says that the money is given and people. And they've managed to collect more than enough, and everybody trusted what was going on, and the Beit HaMikdash was rebuilt, and all the korbanot were given. And we stop here. Yeah,
we don't read the next part of the story, which is where it goes downhill.
Comes from Aram, and all of a sudden, all the money that they've collected is just given away. To prevent a Aramean invasion. And then in Melachim, he dies and he's assassinated, and we don't describe why, but there's a horrific story we're going to look at in Divrei Yamim, which I think is important for us to understand what the story is really about. This is one of these interesting cases where Divrei Torah, Aniyim b'makom echad, they're poor in one place, they're sparse, but Ashirim b'makom acher. So let's go to Divrei Yamim.
I just want to remind all of our listeners that in general, when you're learning the book of Melachim specifically, many times it's really, really important and fruitful to learn it alongside the Prakim and Divrei Yamim. Not all the stories have a parallel, and not all of them have a parallel that's so incredibly different, but often we have a very big difference. Even just in the case of Melachim, which, as we know, theologically is always looking at the religious character of the kings and cares less about the wars that they fight a lot of times, unless the war itself has a theological message. So as we just said, the summary of the interaction with Aram and paying away, basically paying them to not conquer them, is told in 2 psukim. That's very little. It was a very big element, very big political element of his career. And so this is really, it's really explained in much more detail in Divrei Yamim. Which parak are we in?
So we're in Divrei Yamim Bet, parak Chaf Daled.
Okay.
And I'm going to discuss first the description of the Beit HaMikdash and the reforms that he makes from the story in Divrei Yamim. I'm going to paraphrase and not try to read word for word. He's appointed the Kohanim and he's asked them a simple request: go out and raise money from the people. Go out. And he turns the Kohanim into fundraisers. And the advantage of that, I think, is everybody's now a sense of feeling involved. And when you are personally raising money for something, and I think this is an important point that we should remember when reading with this story, raising money is a spiritual endeavor. Raising money to help teach Torah, to build a Beit HaMikdash, this is as much a spiritual act as it is to sit in the Beit Midrash. And many times we don't feel comfortable asking people to help. This story tells us, that you're supposed to go out and you're supposed to involve people and you're supposed to bring people into this, that they should show commitment and they can show an involvement. Unfortunately, the Levim do this fundraising tour, but nothing is being built. And the Radak assumes that Yoash is looking at them, where's the money? What's happening? The Radak explains that they did not have enough money at the time. They had not raised enough money. And the reason for that may be is that this is a Beit HaMikdash that just doesn't need a couple touch-ups. This is a full renovation project. It describes building the foundations, bringing stone and wood. That's not kelim. It's not like we're going to put a nice new plaque on the wall. This is, we really have to rebuild everything. Divrei Yamim says, interestingly enough, that the Beit HaMikdash had been ransacked by Atalia and her sons, to which Chazal say, at a side point, she has sons independent of she's committed adultery. Like the Chazal will not hold back on Atalia. There's no need to treat, to be nice to the daughter of Izebel, okay?
Yeah.
Izebel at least gets credit for being a good dancer at weddings, but Atalia, everything. And if she has sons that are ransacking the Beit HaMikdash, they must be from adultery.
Yeah, they must not be
Product
Israelite.
of an illicit union, which is, they really don't like her. With good reason.
Yeah, with good reason.
With good reason. And with that in mind, so on one hand, that's wonderful that you're getting people out and fundraising, but there's two problems. The first problem, as we mentioned, is this is too big a job for simple fundraising. Sometimes you have to go out and have the king be personally involved. There are some commentators, I know Rabbi Rivlin in his book on the Haftorah talks about Haftorah Rishuyot, that is Yoash, too involved in debate to Mikdash. And we have this discussion, the Ramban in Parshat Vayachid, that was the sin of the Hashbaim, that's what he accuses them of. Uziyahu in 2 chapters from now in Divrei Yamim is going to decide, being king is too easy, I'm going to be Kohen Gadol, I'm going to go in. It's important, is there a violation? Is there a boundary? It's important we say Haftorah Rishuyot in the modern sense, in the Western democratic sense, it means that the state has no role in the private individual religious life of the individual. Here, in the Tanakh's understanding of how states work, the king does have a role, obviously, in the religious nature of the people.
Yeah, but again, it's also because of the fact that Yoash's life is a blurring of boundaries, meaning the Beit Mikdash was his home. So the fact that he feels particular responsibility or particular importance to making sure that it still is mefo'ar, that it's something that's put together.
He wants it to look nice. He grew up, he wants it to look nice.
Yeah.
And here's what I'm going to make perhaps the boldest claim. How disappointed is he in the people who raised him that he thinks that they took the money? He grew up among these people and he trusted these people, and I gave you this job and this money just hasn't materialized.
Yeah.
And so he moves to this pushka system, which Alex Israel points out nicely, does 3 things. It restores 3 things that we would consider to be sine qua non of any fundraising. First of all, control is removed from the Kohanim. He take both a representative of the king and a representative of the Beit HaMikdash is there when they count the money. 2, the money is being given anonymously now. People are just coming in and they're giving, and it's not, I'm giving this much. And the nature of fundraising, of course, is, we have the donors, but I want my name on the wall.
Yeah, the ego element to it.
Right, we already have Trump Gaza and Trump Qatar. We don't need Trump Temple. Okay, that would not be a good look for anybody. This sense of building something that belongs to everybody, and there's a sense of accountability that the money is counted, and we now know where it's coming from. We now know where it's going to. And we go back to, why would Yoash be so suspicious of the Kohanim, but he sees the money disappearing? And I want to go back to an interesting pasuk at the very beginning of chapter 24, in describing Yehoyada.
The Kohen.
The Kohen Gadol, in verse 3.
Well, this is the first time it says Kohen Gadol is regarding him. That's the first time we have that phrase in
He's
Tanakh.
actually the first.
Here it's Kohen Rosh, but in Malachim it's Kohen Gadol.
And he's actually the first person, the earliest person mentioned in the Mishnah, giving a drush on a pasuk in Shkalim. Hashem Lashem, is it for the Kohanim or does it belong to Hashem? And the Yehodah is credited with the drasha, which is the earliest drasha we have in our history.
Fascinating.
So let's go to verse 3.
וישא לו יהוידע נשים 2 ויולד בנים ובנות. Keep going.
Question. How well are you versed in the laws of a Kohen Gadol?
Enough to know that this doesn't fit.
Something here
We have him marrying. He marries 2 women and he has many children.
ויזקן יהוידע, ויספע ימים, וימות בן 130 שנה במותו, ויקברוהו בעיר דוד עם המלאכים.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah.
So if we're talking about the bifurcation of boundaries,
Yes, he's basically made himself a king.
He's become a king. And these are subtle hints that something he's had to stand in as a king.
Yeah.
He's the one who raised the king. He's become really the king regent because there's nobody left in the royal family to do that job.
Yeah.
But now he's acting like a king and walking like a king and, marrying like a king. And he's even being buried like a king.
Yeah.
And one can imagine what the pushback is from Yehoash as he sees, the person who raised me and the people who I grew up with, I can't trust them with the money. I have to keep them to account. And one can imagine the tremendous disappointment that he feels and the heartbreak. But how many times have we seen religious leaders, people who are purported religious leaders, people who we look up to, how does that affect the people when they make these mistakes? And I don't want to say that Yehoiada is intentionally here trying to do anything wrong, but there's a sense, but the very fact he feels comfortable marrying two wives, it's interesting. Josephus is so bothered by this. He adds the words, and he married two wives to Yoash. He can't, because the text is so problematic.
Yeah. I think if I'm also just taking your characterization here another step further, and I'm imagining the disillusionment that you're describing of Yoash by seeing those who raised him, who I'm sure he thought were amazing people. I'm thinking very parallel in a sense to Shmuel, basically essentially growing up inside the Mishkan, that you can understand why, once he dies, this figure. So then the description we have is of Yoash basically starting to worship Avodah Zarah and going off the derech. And he's not able to keep in that space anymore. And I think that this disillusionment seems to be kind of like the only way to read this story, because otherwise it's such a drastic turn on the part of Yehoash that it just doesn't really make so much sense.
So what you're referring to is the part that the Haftorah skips and Melachim skips, which is that after the death of Yoash, the ministers come towards Yoash, and they start to bow to him. And he's become very much, with all respect to J.K. Rowling, Yoash is the boy who lived. And not so much that he's worshiping Avodah Zarah, but he himself has become a figure of Avodah Zarah. This is the boy who survived living in the Kodesh Kadoshim, or even in the attic, wherever he grows up, depending on pick your Parshat, it doesn't matter. He's the one who survived. He must be special. And when you start to believe your own propaganda, then you believe that you are,
invincible.
Almost invincible.
Yeah. It even then says later, again in Divrei Yamim, in Pasuk Kaf Bet 22, V'lo zachar Yoash HaMelech HaChesed asher asa Yoyada aviv imo.
Which is mind-boggling, because what's the verse right before? Yoash orders the killing of Yehoiada's son.
Exactly.
He orders the killing of Yehoiada's son. And the Gemara in Shabbos says they did 7 Averot that day. They killed a Kohen, they killed a Navi, they were Matan the Beit HaMikdash. They did it on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur. Okay, they list all the sins that he does. And the sin that the Tanakh wants to tell us is ingratitude.
Yeah.
Of all the things to list that you are ungrateful, that's the issue at hand. That's a very, very interesting, if in fact this is taking place on Yom Kippur. I know Rav Midan has suggested, I've heard him say several times, that Yoash, what we have here is this fight over who's responsible. Can you imagine a Yom Kippur service where the little ribbon doesn't turn white? And here is Zechariah the Navi, the Kohen Gadol as well, telling them, the people, you're doing something wrong, you have to change it. And the response of the people are, no, we don't trust you, the Kohanim, you're the one who's doing something wrong. And that's what leads to this horrific incident. In rabbinic thought, this Zechariah is going to appear one more time. When the general of the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, comes in and sees the blood bubbling from the floor of the Beit HaMikdash, and what blood is this? Oh, it's just Korban blood. Don't worry about it. Don't pay any attention. I'm going to scrape your bones with iron combs if you don't tell me what happened. And he starts killing off tens of thousands of people because of the death of this Navi Zechariah. Not the Navi Zechariah and Treas are later.
Different. This is Yehoiada's son.
But this is a movement where all of a sudden we see that even though Atalia is dead, the sense that the king can do everything and is capable of doing an act like this, that's very reflective of the way Achav was brought up.
Yeah.
From the influence of Achav and Izabel. If you remember the story of Kerem Navot, Achav comes back and he doesn't take the vineyard, and Isabel looks at him like, but you're the king.
You could do whatever you want.
How can you not do whatever you want? And this thinking has unfortunately permeated now into the line of Beit David.
I think it also speaks to how much a person, even though Yoash doesn't grow up with that family, how much the legacy of who they are, and more, it's not just how much it lives through Yoash, but how much the culture that they cultivated permeated the kingdoms. Meaning, a person can change a lot; they could try their best, but ultimately we see that the culture of Achavi Zevel / Atalia, it's sort of it's made its way deeply, as you're saying, into the southern kingdom. And so we have nice efforts. It's planted so deeply. And so it's very disturbing. And even though you do have positive figures, we see that even those positive figures, again, Divrei specifically, is portraying the duality, both of Yehoyada and of Yoash. And again, you have a teeny bit of that duality in the book of Melachim, but more of it in Divrei Yamim.
Divrei Yamim is an interesting book because there are people, both scholars and Parshanim, who say their whole goal is to clean up the house of David. There are at least, I know
not
there
in
are...
this story.
Not in this story.
Yeah.
There are many Malachim of Yehuda get much harsher stories here than they do in the Sefer Malachim.
Yeah.
They're very blunt. They're very, very open about it. The Dot Mikra suggests that beforehand their wicked was known, but they didn't feel the need to write it down. But in the time of Ezra, when they returned, there's a need to preserve these stories. It may just be also the religious viewpoint of Divrei Yamim, which if something goes wrong, then there has to be a sin somewhere. My favorite example is Asa has a sore foot in Malachim, great king, one of the greatest kings. He stops the civil war between the north and the south. Mm-hmm. And he's a sore foot, and Divrei Yamim lambasts him for not running to the words of the Navi, and therefore he gets a sore foot. Everything has a reason, and it's given immediately. So when we read Malachim, and we're looking and saying, how did Yoash go from A to B, from the person who built the Beit HaMikdash, and there's a word we didn't even talk about in Divrei Yamim. The people gave willingly, joyously. There's Mishkan vibes here, okay? The same way that everybody, when we built the Mishkan, everybody donated so happily. Yeah. It says that the people v'yismechu, and they're happy to bring. They want to bring. They want to be a part of it. And this Yoash suddenly becomes in Malachim. We don't understand. He's stripping the Beit HaMikdash down. He's giving it to the Arameans. He's going to get assassinated. What happened to him? And Divrei Yamim comes and says, there's no such thing as something happened. And we have to tell you the story.
Someone doesn't just flip.
People don't just flip.
There's a narrative there that brings them to something. So as we wind down our conversation, why don't we come back to where we began with the topic of Shkalim and see how we can also bring this into the holiday of Purim?
Okay, great. Shkalim, of course, is tax collection notice, but it says something, just a very interesting Gemara that says when Haman goes to King Achashverosh and he says, here are my 10,000 talents of silver, 10,000 talents. Rish Lakish Omer, Galu Lifnei Ribbono Shalom, the Holy One, blessed be he, knew that Haman would do this. Hikdimu shkaleim l'shkalim la'kesef shalcha. The money that Bnei Yisrael give is already preceded. You don't have a chance. If you think you can buy the destruction of the Jewish people, it's not going to happen. And perhaps one of the nicest explanations of that Gemara, I believe, is found in the Sfat Emet, who focuses on the fact that what is Haman's way of convincing Achashverosh that the Jewish people are vulnerable? Am mefuzar u'mefurad. They're separated. They're fighting each other. Lahavdil, what we went through in the year before October 7th, when the Jewish people are fighting each other, we're always at our weakest point. And yet, here comes this mitzvah. We all have to get under the lunka. We have to everybody puts the same amount of money in. Everybody has to take part and brings the people together. And that's the deeper meaning of this story, that the mitzvah of Shkalim really provides a strength to us. It reminds us that we are not just individuals, we are part of one people, and only together can we hold everything together. And that's, I think, really the lesson of Purim as well.
Rabbi Yaakov Beasly, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.